The screwdriver slipped out of my hand and hit the carpet without a sound, because my hands were shaking too hard to hear anything except my own heartbeat. I was kneeling under my own desk at 11 o'clock at night, alone in a building that was supposed to be empty, trying to hide a camera the size of a shirt button inside the seam of a power strip, and I remember thinking, if anyone walks in right now, I will lose everything I have left. 3 days earlier, I had watched my boss sign my name on a document I never wrote, and I still didn't know why. That's where this starts. Not with an alarm clock, not with coffee, not with a normal Tuesday. It starts with a signature that wasn't mine, on a page that could end my career, sitting in a folder that wasn't supposed to exist. My name is Marcus Reyes, and before I tell you what I found on that camera, I want to say something quick and real. If you're the kind of person who likes stories about ordinary people who get pushed into extraordinary situations, and you want a new one delivered every single week, stick around and subscribe to The Quiet Rise, because this channel exists for people like you who still believe the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient. Alright, let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand what my job meant to me before I tell you what it cost me to protect it. I worked as a regional operations coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company in Ohio called Hellbrook Freight Solutions. Nobody outside the industry has ever heard of it, and that's exactly how my boss liked it. Quiet company, quiet paperwork, quiet problems that never made the news. I had been there 6 years. 6 years of showing up early, 6 years of covering other people's mistakes without complaint, 6 years of believing that if I just kept my head down and did good work, eventually somebody would notice. My boss's name was Gregory Voss, regional director, 52 years old. The kind of man who shook your hand a little too firmly so you'd remember who was in charge. He wasn't cruel in an obvious way. He was worse than that. He was charming right up until the moment he needed you to disappear. It started on a Thursday afternoon in March, 3 weeks before the camera, 3 weeks before any of this became the disaster it turned into. I was closing out a shipment reconciliation report, the kind of tedious paperwork nobody reads unless something goes wrong, when I noticed a discrepancy in the fuel surcharge billing for one of our biggest clients, a manufacturing company out of Columbus. The numbers didn't match. Not by a lot, just enough that if you weren't looking closely, you'd never catch it. But I was looking closely, because that was my job, and because something in my gut told me to keep looking even after I found what I found. I pulled the last 4 months of invoices. Same pattern. Small overcharges, always under the threshold that would trigger an automatic audit. Always adjusted back to normal the following month, so the books balanced out over a quarter. It was clean. It was careful. It was the kind of thing you only notice if you've spent 6 years learning exactly how the numbers are supposed to look. I sat at my desk that Thursday evening, long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a spreadsheet that was quietly stealing thousands of dollars from a client who trusted us, and I didn't know yet whose hands were on it. The office was empty except for the hum of the vending machine down the hall and the occasional creak of the building settling, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed about how nervous I was over a set of numbers, telling myself I was probably overreacting, that there was likely a simple explanation waiting for me in the morning. I printed the 4 months of invoices anyway, highlighted every discrepancy in yellow, and stacked them neatly in a folder before locking my desk drawer. Some instinct in me already understanding that I might need to prove, later, that I had found this on my own and reported it honestly the moment I noticed it. I drove home that night going over the numbers in my head instead of listening to the radio, and Elena was already asleep by the time I got in. So I sat at the kitchen table by myself with a glass of water, turning the pattern over and over, trying to decide whether I was seeing something real or just tired eyes, making innocent rounding errors look sinister. In the morning, Sophia asked me why I looked like I hadn't slept, and I told her I'd just had a busy week, which wasn't exactly a lie, though it wasn't the whole truth either. I've thought since about how much of that entire ordeal I carried quietly in those early days, not wanting to worry my family over something that might turn out to be nothing, not yet understanding how far from nothing it actually was. I did what any reasonable employee would do. I brought it to Gregory the next morning. I remember exactly how he reacted, because I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count. He didn't get angry. He didn't get defensive. He just leaned back in his leather chair, laced his fingers together, and said, "Marcus, that's a great catch. Let me look into it. Don't mention this to anyone else yet, all right? I don't want to start a panic over what might just be a billing software glitch." I nodded. I believed him. That was my first mistake, and I want you to remember that moment, because everything after this got worse in ways I never saw coming. A week passed, nothing changed. The discrepancy showed up again in the new billing cycle. Same pattern, same careful math. I brought it up again, this time a little more directly, and Gregory's tone shifted just slightly, just enough that I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I said, "I'm handling it," he told me, not looking up from his monitor. "You've got enough on your plate, Marcus. Focus on your own numbers." I left his office that day feeling like I had just been told, without anyone saying it out loud, to stop asking questions I wasn't supposed to ask. That should have been the end of it for most people. I probably would have let it go too. Told myself it wasn't my problem. Kept my head down like I always had. But 3 days after that conversation, something happened that changed everything. I got called into HR. I sat across from a woman named Denise Okafor, our HR director. A woman I respected because she had never once played favorites in 6 years of watching her handle conflicts fairly. She slid a folder across the table to me, and I felt my whole chest tighten before I even opened it. Inside was a formal write-up, dated 2 days earlier, alleging that I had manually altered client billing records without authorization. At the bottom of the page was a signature. My signature. Except I had never signed it. I had never even seen that document before that exact moment. Marcus, Denise said carefully, watching my face. Gregory brought this to me personally. He said you came to him confused and overwhelmed, and that when he reviewed the billing errors, they traced back to changes made under your login credentials. My mouth went dry. I remember trying to speak and nothing coming out for a few seconds, because the accusation was so precise, so calculated, that it took my brain a moment to catch up to what was actually happening. He wasn't covering up the theft anymore. He was making sure that if anyone ever found it, it would lead straight back to me. That's not my signature, I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. I never touched those records. I brought this discrepancy to Gregory myself, twice, and he told me he was handling it. Denise studied me for a long moment, and I could see she wasn't sure who to believe, which honestly was fair, because on paper, it looked bad. It looked like an employee panicking after getting caught. She told me she would investigate further and asked me not to discuss the matter with any coworkers in the meantime. I walked out of that office feeling like the floor had been pulled out from under me, and I understood, for the first time, that Gregory wasn't just covering his own tracks. He was building a case against me before I even knew I needed a defense. That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 40 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I kept thinking about my daughter, Sophia, 7 years old, who had just started asking questions about what her dad did at work. Proud in the simple way kids are proud of their parents, without needing a reason. I thought about my wife, Elena, who had gone back to school for her nursing degree 2 years earlier, which meant our finances were tight enough that losing this job wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. I thought about 6 years of showing up early and doing things the right way, and how none of that seemed to matter anymore against one forged signature and a boss who had decided I was expendable. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept replaying every conversation with Gregory, looking for the moment I had made myself a target, and I couldn't find it, because the truth was simpler and colder than that. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had just noticed something he needed nobody to notice, and that made me a liability he needed to remove. Elena noticed something was wrong, almost immediately. She's always been better at reading me than I am at hiding things from her. One night, after Sophie had gone to bed, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and just waited. The way she does when she knows pushing me will only make me shut down further. Somebody at work is trying to blame me for something I didn't do, I finally told her. I explained the discrepancy, the forged signature, the write-up, all of it, watching her face shift from confusion to concern to something harder. Something that looked a lot like anger on my behalf. You need proof, she said, not as a question. If it's his word against yours, and he's the director, you're going to lose that fight, unless you can prove exactly what happened. She was right, and we both knew it, but proof wasn't something I could just wish into existence. I needed to see what Gregory was actually doing when nobody else was watching, and there was only one way to do that. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. I struggled with the decision to place a hidden camera in my own office for almost a full week. It felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could uncross. I researched the legality of it obsessively, late at night after Elena and Sophia were asleep, because the last thing I needed was to solve one problem by creating a worse one. Ohio is what's called a one-party consent state for audio recordings, which meant recording conversations I was personally part of was legal. But I made the decision early on that I wouldn't record audio of conversations I wasn't involved in, and I would only place the camera in my own workspace, never in shared areas, never in anyone else's office, never anywhere that could be considered an invasion of someone else's privacy. I wasn't trying to spy on the whole company. I was trying to protect myself from a man who was actively building a false case against me using my own desk as the crime scene. That's how I ended up on my knees under my desk at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Hands shaking, hiding a small camera inside the casing of a power strip that faced my computer monitor and the small filing cabinet beside it. The exact spot where, if Gregory was doing what I suspected he was doing, he would need physical access to make it look convincing. I had told the night security guard, a kind older man named Walt, who I'd known for years, that I forgot my phone charger and needed 5 extra minutes. He waved me through without a second thought, and that small kindness from someone who trusted me only made the weight in my chest heavier, because I realized how much trust I was risking to protect myself from someone who had none for me. The first 3 days, nothing happened. I checked the footage each night from my phone, sitting in my car in the driveway so Elena and Sophia wouldn't hear the anxiety in my voice if something showed up. Just me at my desk during the day, an empty office at night, the cleaning crew passing through around 8. I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if maybe I was so scared and cornered that I was seeing conspiracy where there was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Elena told me to give it time. If he's willing to forge a signature, she said, he's not going to stop after one document. Men like that don't stop. They just get more careful, unless they think nobody's watching. On the fourth night, at 9:47 p.m., according to the timestamp, Gregory walked into my office. I watched the footage the next morning before work, sitting in my car with my coffee going cold in the cup holder, and I felt something between vindication and pure sickness settle into my stomach at the same time. He used his master key to unlock my office door, which he had every right to do as regional director, so that part wasn't damning on its own. But what he did next made my hands go cold around my phone. He sat down at my desk, logged into my computer using credentials I later confirmed he shouldn't have had access to, and spent almost 11 minutes navigating through my billing software, under my login. He printed something. He signed a printed page, not with his own signature, but practicing something, glancing at a piece of paper beside him that I recognized immediately, because it was a printed copy of my actual signature from an old expense report, something he must have pulled from HR files or old paperwork. He was forging my handwriting, practicing Italiano, getting it right, before committing it to a document that would end my career. I sat in that car for a long time after the footage ended, and I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as the difference between fear and resolve. I had been scared for 2 weeks, scared of losing my job, scared of being unable to provide for my family, scared of a man with more power than me deciding my fate. But watching him practice my signature, like it was nothing, like I was nothing, something in me went quiet and cold and focused in a way I hadn't felt before. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to make sure the truth came out, no matter what it cost. I didn't go to Denise right away. And I know some people might question that choice, but I needed more than one night of footage. One incident could still be explained away, minimized, twisted into something ambiguous by a man who had clearly thought this through, more carefully than I initially gave him credit for. I needed a pattern. I needed enough evidence that there was no room left for doubt. No room for him to charm his way out of it, the way he'd charmed his way through 6 years of quietly stealing from clients who trusted him. Over the next 2 weeks, the camera captured 4 more visits. Gregory adjusting billing records under my login on a Tuesday night. Gregory on a phone call I could see, but not hear, gesturing angrily at my monitor, clearly frustrated about something. And then, on the second Thursday, something I hadn't expected at all, something that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. He wasn't alone. A woman I didn't recognize walked into my office with him that night, dressed professionally, carrying a laptop bag. They spoke for almost 20 minutes. And even without audio, I could read enough from their body language to understand this wasn't a casual conversation. She sat at my desk. She typed something. Gregory paced behind her, checking his phone repeatedly, glancing at the office door every few seconds, like he was afraid someone would walk in. I didn't know who she was yet, but I knew she wasn't just a coworker helping out. Whatever this was, it was bigger than one man quietly padding invoices to skim a little extra money off the top. This looked organized. This looked practiced. This looked like something that had been happening long before I ever noticed a discrepancy in a fuel surcharge. I spent the following weekend trying to identify her carefully, without raising suspicion anywhere. I finally recognized her from a company directory photo I found while cross-referencing old email chains I had legitimate access to as part of my normal job duties. Her name was Patricia Lindquist, and she worked in our accounts payable department at a different regional office, 2 hours away in Cleveland. She had no reason to be in my office, in my building using my computer, unless she was part of whatever Gregory was building. I brought everything to Elena that Sunday night, laid it all out on our kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that were only just starting to form a picture. "This isn't about you anymore," she said quietly, and I could see her processing the same fear I was feeling. The fear that came with realizing we were no longer dealing with one man protecting his job, but possibly something involving multiple people, multiple locations, and money that had likely been disappearing for a lot longer than 4 months. "You need to be careful, Marcus. If this is bigger than we think, and they figure out this stops being about a write-up. This becomes about making sure you can't talk." I won't pretend that didn't scare me, because it did, more than anything else in this entire situation. But I also knew that going quiet now, after everything I'd already risked, meant letting a forged signature sit in my personnel file forever, meant possibly losing my job over something I never did, and meant letting whatever this actually was continue without anyone ever knowing. I decided I needed one more piece of evidence before I brought this to anyone. Something that would connect the dots clearly enough that nobody could dismiss it as coincidence or misunderstanding. Before that final piece came together, something happened that almost derailed everything. A coworker named Todd Grissom, who sat 2 desks down from me and had never shown much interest in my business before, started asking odd questions. "Hey, you working late a lot lately?" he asked one Wednesday morning, not quite looking at me while he said it, stirring his coffee a beat too long. I brushed it off as small talk, But 2 days later I noticed him lingering near my office doorway after hours, glancing at the power strip under my desk in a way that made my stomach drop. I couldn't tell if he'd noticed the camera or if I was simply paranoid enough by that point to read danger into everything. I mentioned it to Elena that night, and she went quiet for a long moment before saying what I was already thinking. If Gregory's got someone else watching you, this just got a lot more dangerous. I started arriving earlier and leaving through a different exit, checking the footage from home instead of the parking lot, and for 3 days I genuinely considered pulling the camera and walking away from the entire thing. What kept me going wasn't courage. Not exactly. It was picturing that forged signature sitting permanently in my file, waiting for the day someone finally noticed the fabricated account and came looking for whoever's name was on it. That final piece came on a rainy Wednesday night, almost 3 weeks after I'd first placed the camera. Gregory came in alone this time, later than usual, almost midnight, according to the Times. He looked different on camera that night. Moriaji thought, checking his phone constantly, pacing instead of sitting. Me da cal? I still couldn't hear audio outside conversations I was personally part of, so I couldn't make out words. But I watched him grow increasingly tense over the course of the call, running his hand through his hair, gripping the edge of my desk at one point like he needed something solid to hold on to. Then he opened my filing cabinet, the one beside my desk, using a key I didn't even know existed for a cabinet I had assumed only I had access to, and pulled out a thin folder I had never seen before. He sat there for almost 10 minutes, going through pages, occasionally photographing something with his phone, before placing the folder back exactly where he found it, and locking the cabinet again. The next morning, I came in early, before anyone else, and opened that filing cabinet myself, using my own key. My hands trembling slightly as I searched through files. I thought I knew completely. Near the bike behind old expense reports I hadn't touched in months. I found it, a folder labeled with a client account number I didn't recognize, containing invoices for a company that, as far as I knew, didn't exist within our normal client roster. Shipping records for loads that had supposedly been delivered to locations that made no logistical sense given our actual route network. Payment confirmations for amounts that didn't correspond to any shipment weight or distance I could reasonably calculate. I photographed every page with my phone, careful not to disturb the original placement, my heart pounding so hard I was sure someone would hear it from the hallway. This wasn't just billing manipulation anymore. This looked like an entirely fabricated client account, something built specifically to move money somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. Hidden inside a filing cabinet in my own office, under my own name, waiting to be discovered by someone who would immediately look guilty simply because of where it was found. I understood then, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, despite the fear underneath it, exactly what Gregory's plan had been from the very beginning. He wasn't just forging my signature on one write-up. He was building an entire paper trail that would make it look like I had created a fake client account and been stealing from the company for months, using my office, my login, my filing cabinet, my signature. If anyone ever discovered the fraud, and eventually someone would, because money like that doesn't stay hidden forever, I would be the one holding the folder. I would be the one going to prison while Gregory and whoever he was working with disappeared into early retirement with money that was never theirs. That afternoon, I called Denise and asked for a private meeting, telling her only that it was extremely urgent and needed to happen away from the office. We met at a coffee shop 20 minutes from Halbrook's headquarters, and I brought my laptop, 3 weeks of camera footage, and photographs of the folder from the filing cabinet. I watched her face change as I walked her through everything. The discrepancy, the forged signature practice, Patricia Lindquist's unexplained visit, the midnight filing cabinet search, and finally the fabricated client folder sitting where anyone investigating would find it and assume I had put it there myself. I need you to understand something before we go any further, Denise said quietly. Once I finished, her professional composure clearly working overtime to process what she'd just seen. If this is what it looks like, this isn't an HR matter anymore. This is criminal fraud, potentially involving multiple people across 2 locations, and possibly amounts of money large enough to warrant law enforcement involvement, not just an internal investigation. I nodded, because I had already come to the same conclusion somewhere around the 3rd night of footage, even if I hadn't wanted to admit it to myself yet. I know, I said. I just needed someone besides my wife to see it before I decided what to do next. Denise made a decision that I will always respect her for, even though it complicated things significantly in the short term, rather than confronting Gregory directly, which could have given him time to destroy evidence or accelerate whatever plan he had for me. She brought the situation to Halbrook's corporate legal counsel and, within 48 hours, to an outside forensic accountant, the company retained for serious financial investigations. I was asked to continue working normally, to give no indication that anything had changed, while the investigation quietly gathered additional evidence beyond what I had already provided. Those 2 weeks were, without question, the hardest of this entire experience, harder even than the moment I first found the forged signature, because now I had to sit across from Gregory every single day, exchange pleasant morning greetings, listen to him ask about my weekend, all while knowing what I knew and carrying the constant fear that he might realize I was onto him before the investigation had enough to act. There was one afternoon, about a week into that waiting period, when Gregory stopped by my desk holding a mug of coffee and asked, almost casually, whether I'd made any progress figuring out that fuel surcharge issue I'd brought to him weeks earlier. I remember my hands going still on the keyboard, my mind racing through every possible reason he might be asking now after so many weeks of telling me to drop it. Still looking into it, I told him, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. He studied me for a second longer than felt comfortable, then smiled and said, "Good man. Don't let it eat at you too much." It walked Hawaii and I sat there for a full minute, just breathing, wondering if that had been a genuine question or a test, wondering if Todd had told him something, wondering if my carefully controlled expression had given anything away. Elena noticed the toll it was taking on me even when I tried to hide it. I stopped sleeping through the night. I started double-checking the locks on our house before bed, something I'd never done before, a habit that embarrassed me even as I did it, because logically I knew Gregory wasn't going to show up at my home. But fear doesn't always listen to logic, especially when you've just discovered that someone you worked beside for years was capable of building an entire false version of you to protect himself. Elena and I barely slept during those 2 weeks. Sophia noticed something was wrong, the way kids always do, even when you think you're hiding it well. And one night she climbed into our bed and asked me if I was going to lose my job, because she'd overheard part of a hushed conversation between Elena and me that we thought had happened after she was asleep. I remember holding her and telling her that everything was going to be okay, that sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems at work, but that her daddy hadn't done anything wrong, and that mattered more than anything else. I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself in that moment, but I needed her to believe it, because 7-year-olds shouldn't have to carry the weight of adult fear. The forensic accountant's findings, when they finally came together, were worse than even I had imagined sitting in that coffee shop with Denise. The fabricated client account had been active for almost 14 months, and had funneled just over $340,000 through fake shipment invoices before I had ever noticed the smaller, more recent discrepancy that started this entire chain of events. Patricia Lindquist, it turned out, wasn't just helping Gregory. She had her own accounts payable access at the Cleveland office, which meant she could approve payments on the receiving end that Gregory generated on the shipping end, creating a closed loop that would have been nearly impossible to catch through normal auditing procedures, because both sides of the fraudulent transaction were controlled by people who understood exactly how to make fake paperwork look legitimate. What I hadn't expected, what genuinely surprised even the forensic investigators, was what emerged about Gregory's motivation once the full financial picture came into view. This wasn't simple greed dressed up as opportunity. Gregory's son had been in a serious car accident almost 2 years earlier, leaving him with medical bills that, even with insurance, had climbed into territory that would have bankrupted most families. I'm not sharing this to excuse what he did, because forging my signature and attempting to frame me for his crimes to protect himself was inexcusable regardless of his reasons, and I want to be honest about how angry that made me even after I learned the full story. But understanding it did something to how I carried this experience afterward. It reminded me that people don't usually set out to become villains. They make one desperate choice under pressure, and then they make another to cover the first one. And eventually the choices pile up until the person doing them can't see any way out except forward, deeper into something they never intended to build. The confrontation itself happened on a Monday morning, and I wasn't in the room for the initial part of it, though Denise told me afterward that Gregory didn't even try to deny it once the corporate attorney laid out the forensic accounting findings alongside the camera footage. I was called into a separate conference room about 90 minutes later, where Denise, the company's general counsel, and a representative from corporate HR sat waiting for me with expressions I couldn't quite read. For a brief, terrifying second, old fear crept back in, the same fear I'd felt sitting in that first meeting with the forged write-up, wondering if somehow this had all gone wrong, if somehow I was still going to be the one walking out of that building without a job. Instead, the general counsel, a calm woman named Patricia, no relation to the other Patricia in this story, thanked me for the evidence I had gathered and for handling the situation with what she called remarkable restraint and professionalism under extraordinary pressure. She confirmed that Gregory Voss had been terminated immediately and that the company was cooperating fully with law enforcement regarding both him and Patricia. The forged write-up in my personnel file was removed entirely, replaced with a formal letter acknowledging that I had been the one to originally identify the billing discrepancy and had been targeted specifically because of that discovery. I sat there listening to all of this, and I remember feeling strangely numb, like my body hadn't quite caught up to the fact that the thing I'd been afraid of for over a month was actually, finally, over. I want to tell you that everything wrapped up cleanly after that, but real life doesn't usually work that way. And I'd be lying to you if I made it sound simpler than it actually was. The criminal case against Gregory and Patricia took almost 8 months to resolve, during which I was called to provide testimony twice, sitting across from lawyers who asked me to walk through every night of camera footage in exhausting, repetitive detail. Gregory ultimately pleaded guilty to wire fraud and falsification of business records, avoiding a trial in exchange for a reduced sentence, and I later learned he received 4 years, with restitution ordered for the full amount taken. though I have no illusions about how much of that money will actually ever be repaid. Patricia received a shorter sentence, given her more limited role, but lost her professional license and, from what I understand, her marriage as well. Though that's not something I know the full details of and don't feel it's my place to speculate on. Todd Grissom, as it turned out, had nothing to do with Gregory's scheme at all. I learned later, through an awkward but honest conversation over coffee months after everything settled, that he'd simply noticed I seemed stressed and had been debating whether to ask if I was okay, worried in his own quiet way about a coworker who looked like he was carrying something heavy. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, hearing that. Relief that I hadn't been walking into a second trap. Guilt that I'd spent days treating a decent man's concern as a threat. I told him, in general terms, that work had been difficult for a while, but that things were better now. And he nodded like he understood there was more to it than I was saying, and didn't push. Some people, I learned, extend trust without needing every detail first, and I've tried to remember that since, especially now that I'm the one people occasionally come to with concerns about something that doesn't look right. What surprised me most, in the months that followed, wasn't the legal outcome or even keeping my job, though both of those mattered enormously to me and to my family. What surprised me was how the experience changed the way I moved through my own workplace afterward. I became Regional Operations Coordinator for the entire Ohio division within a year, a promotion that came with real hesitation on my part, because part of me worried that stepping into a leadership role meant becoming the kind of person who might, someday, under enough pressure, make the same kind of desperate choice Gregory had made. I talked about that fear openly with Elena more than once, late at night, and she told me something I've held on to ever since. The difference between you and him, she said, isn't that you never felt pressure. It's that when you found something wrong, you didn't cover it up to protect yourself. You told the truth even when it was terrifying, even when it would have been easier not to. I think about that a lot. The first few months in the new role were harder than I expected. Not because of the workload, which I understood well after 6 years in the department, but because of the quiet weight of walking into Gregory's old office, sitting at what had once been his desk, knowing what he'd been capable of within those same walls. I asked facilities to swap out the desk entirely before I moved in, which probably seemed like an odd request to the maintenance team. But I couldn't shake the feeling of building my new responsibilities on top of the exact furniture where he'd practiced forging my signature. Deneen understood without me having to explain it fully. She'd seen enough of the case to know that some things aren't really about superstition. They're about needing a clean start that actually feels clean. She even helped me pick out the replacement desk herself, a small gesture that meant more to me than she probably realized, since it was the first time since this whole ordeal began that someone had helped me build something forward instead of just helping me survive what had already happened. I kept the folder from that night, the original one with the highlighted invoices, in a locked drawer in my new office. Not because I needed it anymore, for any legal purpose, but because it reminded me of the version of myself who noticed something wrong and chose to report it honestly before he had any idea what that choice would eventually cost him. Some days, when a new employee brings me a concern that feels small, a rounding error, a strange note in a shipment log, something that might be nothing, I think about that folder, and I make sure I give their concern the attention it deserves the first time they raise it, because I know exactly what it costs someone when nobody does. I also changed how I managed my own team once I stepped into that role, in ways I don't think I would have without going through what I went through. I made it a point, early on, to tell every new hire in my department that if they ever noticed something that looked wrong, a number that didn't add up, a process that felt off, they should bring it to me directly. And I would take it seriously the first time they said it. Not the third or fourth time after they'd worked up the courage to push harder. I think about how differently things might have gone if Gregory had simply looked into that fuel surcharge discrepancy honestly the first time I brought it to him. Instead of quietly deciding I was a problem to be managed rather than an employee doing his job well. I never want anyone on my team to feel like they have to build a criminal case just to be believed. Denise and I still work together, and she's told me more than once that this case changed how the entire company handles internal reporting, that Halbrook implemented new auditing checkpoints specifically designed to catch the kind of closed-loop fraud that Gregory and Patricia had built, checkpoints that exist now because of what happened to me. There's something quietly meaningful about that, knowing that whatever I went through wasn't just survived, but turned into something that protects other people from going through the same thing. Sophia is 9 now, and she still doesn't know the full details of what happened that year. Though someday, when she's older, I plan to tell her the whole story, because I want her to understand that doing the right thing when it's difficult isn't about being fearless. I was scared through almost every part of this. Scared kneeling under my desk with a screwdriver at 11 at night. Scared sitting across from Gregory every morning pretending I didn't know what I knew. Scared that even with proof, somehow the truth wouldn't be enough. Doing the right thing was never about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and choosing to act honestly anyway, because the alternative, staying silent and letting an innocent version of events collapse under someone else's lie, was a fear I couldn't live with either. I think about that folder in the filing cabinet sometimes, The one built specifically to make me look guilty of something I never did. And I think about how close I came to simply trusting the system to sort itself out without my involvement. 2. Assuming that surely someone else would catch it eventually. That surely the truth would come out on its own, without me having to risk everything to help it along. I don't think that's always true. Sometimes the truth needs someone willing to kneel under a desk in the dark and take a risk that terrifies them. Because the alternative is letting a lie become the official record of what happened. So here's what I want to ask you, because I think this is worth sitting with for a moment before you go. If you found yourself in a position like mine, watching something wrong happen around you, knowing that speaking up could put your job, your reputation, maybe even your safety at risk, what would you have done? Would you have gone looking for proof the way I did? Or would you have found a reason to look away? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. So if this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me honestly, because these conversations matter more than people realize, and I read every single one. If someone in your life needs to hear a story like this today, someone who's facing their own version of a forged signature or an unfair accusation, please consider sharing this with them. Sometimes the person who needs to hear it isn't going through it publicly at all. They're sitting quietly at their own kitchen table right now, turning over a decision they're scared to make, wondering if speaking up is worth the risk. You never know whose kitchen table this story might end up on tonight. You never know who might need the reminder that the truth is always worth protecting, even when protecting it is terrifying. Thank you for spending time with The Quiet Rise. I'll see you in the next story.